Small acts. Insignificant in isolation. But they accumulated, spreading across the planet like light spreading across water, each tiny flame illuminating the darkness around it. The alien coalition watched with something approaching awe. We have monitored 17 civilizations facing the silence, Talvesh reported. All of them showed the same pattern. Initial resistance followed by gradual erosion of will. Within months, their societies began to collapse from the inside. Productivity declined. Birth rates plummeted. Art and creativity vanished as the population lost the ability to imagine futures worth living for. Humanity's pattern is different. Your civilization is not declining. If anything, your species appears to be intensifying. Art production has increased 40%. Birth rates have stabilized after years of decline. Acts of kindness between strangers have risen to levels we have never recorded in any species facing existential threat. We do not understand what is happening, but we are beginning to hope. The silence made its move on the anniversary of its arrival. No one knew exactly what happened. One moment, it was a darkness hanging in the sky. The next, it was everywhere. A presence that pressed against every human mind simultaneously, offering the same seductive whisper it had used to defeat countless civilizations before. Stop fighting. Stop struggling. Stop pretending your brief existence matters. The void is peaceful. The void is quiet. The void asks nothing of you except surrender. Kel felt it like a wave crashing over him, dragging him toward depths he couldn't see. Every failure of his life surfaced in his mind. The soldiers he couldn't save, the marriage that collapsed, the years of isolation and despair. The voice of the silence wrapped around those memories, amplifying them, transforming them into evidence that struggle was pointless. You have suffered enough, the silence whispered. You have carried weight that would have broken lesser beings. But there is no reward for endurance. No meaning in persistence. Just more pain, stretching forward into an infinite future of loss and grief and disappointment. Let go. Rest. The void will welcome you. For a single, terrible moment, Cal wanted to surrender. And then he thought of Maria pouring coffee at a truck stop, surviving because she didn't know how to stop. He thought of Thomas, his scarred lungs still breathing, still fighting fires in his dreams. He thought of all the broken people who had found each other through his network, who had transformed their wounds into weapons and their despair into defiance. He thought of that soldier in the ruins, handing bread to a child. No. Cal pushed back against the silence with everything he had, not with strength, not with weapons, but with the simple, irrational stubbornness that had defined humanity since the first ancestor chose to stand and fight instead of running. No. My suffering was not meaningless. My scars are not evidence that hope is foolish. Every wound I carry is proof that I kept going when giving up would have been easier. And I will keep going now. Not because I know I'll win. Not because the universe promises any reward for persistence. But because that's what humans do. That's what we've always done. And that's what we'll keep doing until the last one of us draws the last breath, and maybe even after that. Across the planet, billions of humans were having the same moment. The silence pressed against each mind, offering the same temptation, and found something it had never encountered before. Resistance that didn't weaken over time. Defiance that grew stronger with each failure. Hope that burned brighter precisely because it was irrational, because it defied every logical argument for surrender. The silence pushed harder. Humanity pushed back. And somewhere in that impossible stalemate, something shifted. The alien coalition would later describe what happened as unprecedented in recorded galactic history. The silence, the entity that had consumed meaning itself, that had defeated civilization spanning millennia, began to shrink. Not quickly, not dramatically, but measurably, undeniably, impossibly. The void that had swallowed stars began to contract, its edges pulling back from a species that refused to stop fighting. Talvesh's transmission arrived 3 days after the retreat began. We have analyzed the event using every tool at our disposal. Our conclusion defies everything we thought we understood about the nature of existential threats. The silence feeds on despair. It grows stronger when civilizations lose hope, when they accept that resistance is meaningless. Every species before humanity followed this pattern eventually. Even the strongest eventually succumb to the logical argument that persistence against infinite darkness serves no purpose. But humanity does not operate on logic. Your species persists despite logic. You hope when hope makes no sense. You fight when fighting cannot succeed. You transform your suffering into strength through mechanisms we cannot explain and cannot replicate. The silence encountered for the first time a species whose despair fuels defiance rather than surrender. Every wound it inflicted made you stronger. Every argument for hopelessness strengthened your determination to hope anyway. It is retreating because it cannot feed. It is weakening because humanity refuses to provide what it needs to survive. You have not defeated the silence. Nothing can truly defeat an absence. But you have done something no other species has accomplished. You have made it afraid. Cal Rios stood on the porch of his cabin, watching the stars emerge in the Montana sky. It had been 3 months since the silence retreated beyond the orbit of Neptune. The world was slowly returning to something like normal, or rather, something like the new normal that emerged when humanity collectively stared into the void and refused to blink. Things were different now. Not perfect. Humans were still humans, still fractured and contentious and gloriously chaotic. But something had shifted in the collective consciousness. A recognition that the qualities which had always seemed like weaknesses, the stubbornness, the irrationality, the refusal to accept defeat, were actually the species' greatest strengths. Cal's network had evolved into something larger, a global community of survivors who understood what humanity had almost lost and what they had discovered about themselves in the process of not losing it. Maria was leading training programs for healthcare workers, teaching them how to transform burnout into resilience. Thomas had returned to firefighting, his scarred lungs somehow finding new capacity. Aisha was working with veterans, helping them understand that their wounds were not failures but preparations for moments that mattered. And Cal himself had found something he thought he'd lost forever: purpose. The Alien Coalition had offered humanity a place in the galactic community, not as members, not yet, but as observers. Watching, learning, preparing for whatever challenges the universe might present next. They wanted humans involved because humanity had proven something the galaxy desperately needed to understand. That hope was not logical. That persistence was not rational. That the will to continue, to fight, to believe in meaning despite every argument against it, that these qualities were not bugs in the human operating system but features. Essential features that had been tested across millennia and found to be, against all odds, exactly what the universe needed. Cal heard footsteps on the gravel behind him. He didn't turn around, he already knew who it was. Talvesh climbed the porch steps and settled into the empty chair beside him, the same chair he had occupied on the night everything changed. The Coalition has been debating your species' future, the alien said. There are still factions who believe humanity is too dangerous to be trusted with galactic knowledge. Too unpredictable. Too volatile. Cal smiled slightly. They're probably right. They are certainly right, Talvesh agreed. But that is precisely the point. The galaxy has enough stable civilizations. Enough careful, calculated species who weigh every risk and avoid every danger. What we lacked, until now, was a species willing to charge into darkness without knowing what lay on the other side. He turned those swirling, ancient eyes toward Cal. We spent 6,000 years watching humanity, waiting for you to destroy yourselves. Instead, you taught us something we had forgotten in our centuries of careful observation. That survival is not about avoiding risk. It is about finding meaning in the face of annihilation. About choosing to hope when hope makes no sense. Cal thought about the soldiers he had served with, the ones who had died and the ones who had survived. He thought about his grandfather working his farm until the last day of his life, his mother raising children alone, the endless parade of humans across history who had faced impossible odds and refused to surrender. We didn't do anything special, Cal said. We just did what we've always done. Yes, Talvesh replied. That is what makes it special. They sat in silence for a while, watching stars that had seemed so distant a year ago and now felt somehow closer. Somewhere out there, the silence was still lurking, still waiting, still hoping that humanity would eventually succumb to the despair that had defeated every other species it had encountered. It would be waiting a very long time. What happens now? Cal asked finally. Talvesh rose from his chair, his gray robes settling around him like water finding its level. Now humanity takes its place among the stars. Not as conquerors or subjects, but as something the galaxy has never seen before. A species that transforms suffering into strength, that finds hope in hopelessness, that refuses to stop fighting no matter how many times the universe breaks them. He paused at the edge of the porch, looking up at the sky. The universe has been watching you for 6,000 years, Cal Rios. Waiting to see what you would become. And now that we know, now that we have seen what humanity is capable of, there is only one thing left to say. Cal raised an eyebrow. What's that? Talvesh's swirling eyes seemed to brighten, reflecting starlight in patterns Cal had learned to recognize as the alien equivalent of a smile. Welcome to the galaxy. We are terrified to have you here. And we have never been more grateful for anything in our existence. They didn't have a name. They didn't have leaders or hierarchy or official membership. They simply had each other, and the knowledge that their suffering had not been meaningless. Talvesh observed from a distance, sending occasional transmissions that Cal shared with the others. The alien coalition was monitoring humanity's response to their quiet intervention, documenting how the residual humans organized themselves, analyzing patterns that their most advanced algorithms struggled to predict. "Your species continues to surprise us," Talvesh reported after 6 months. "We expected you to build institutions, formal structures with rules and ranks and clear chains of command. Instead, you have created something organic. A network that grows like a living thing, adapting to each new member, resistant to disruption because it has no center to target." Cal smiled when he read that message. He had not designed the network to be resilient. He had simply found people like himself and connected them to each other. The resilience emerged on its own, the same way it always had throughout human history, not from planning but from the accumulated wisdom of individuals who had learned to survive. But the question remained, hovering over every meeting and every conversation like a storm cloud on the horizon. What was coming? What threat had frightened civilizations that spanned galaxies? And how could a ragged collection of burned-out humans possibly prepare for something that advanced aliens couldn't defeat? The answer came on an ordinary Tuesday, 14 months after Cal's journey aboard the alien craft that he was in Chicago, meeting with a group of former gang members who had transformed themselves into community organizers. They gathered in a community center that had once been a church, its stained glass windows casting colored light across faces that had seen violence most people couldn't imagine. Cal's communicator buzzed with an incoming transmission. He stepped outside to read it, expecting another routine update from Talvesh. The message was 3 words long: "IT has arrived." Cal felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Not physically, the sidewalk remained solid concrete, the city continued its endless noise around him, but something fundamental had changed. The waiting was over. He called Maria first, then Thomas, then the others who had become his closest allies over the past year. Within hours, the network was activated, messages spreading through channels both human and alien, reaching the scattered community of survivors who had been preparing without knowing what they were preparing for. Talvesh's next transmission was longer, but not by much. "The entity we call the Silence has entered your solar system. It is not a fleet or an army or anything your species has words for. It is an absence, a void that consumes meaning itself. Every civilization it has encountered has responded in one of 2 ways. They have fled or they have surrendered. None have survived." Cal read the message twice, then 3 times. He waited for fear to arrive, the cold grip that had dominated his life for so many years. It didn't come. Instead, he felt something else entirely. Something that had been building since the moment he touched the memory vault and saw humanity's history through alien eyes. He felt ready. The Silence arrived at Earth's orbit on a Thursday. It was exactly as Talvesh had described, not a physical object but an absence, a place where reality simply stopped. Telescopes couldn't photograph it. Satellites couldn't measure it. Humans only knew it was there because of the stars it blocked, the faint points of light that vanished when they passed behind its impossible edge. The world's governments responded with predictable chaos. Emergency sessions, military mobilizations, desperate attempts to establish communication with something that did not communicate. The alien coalition transmitted what data they had, but their warnings were grim. The Silence does not negotiate. It does not conquer or destroy in any way you would recognize. It simply waits. And eventually, civilizations that face it lose the will to continue. They stop fighting. They stop hoping. They stop believing that resistance has any meaning. And then they fade away, absorbed into the emptiness like light vanishing into a black hole. Cal gathered his network in the community center in Chicago. Hundreds of people filled the space, not leaders or soldiers or anyone the world would consider important. Just survivors. People who had looked into their own personal voids and found something worth continuing for. He stood before them, feeling the weight of their attention, the weight of everything he had learned and everything he still didn't understand. "I don't know how to fight this thing," he said honestly. "I don't know if fighting is even possible. The aliens who have watched us for thousands of years don't know either. They're terrified. They've seen civilizations far more powerful than ours crumble into dust when the Silence came for them." He paused, looking at the faces around him. Maria, with her nurse's eyes that had seen so much death and still found reasons to care. Thomas, his lungs scarred and his spirit unbroken. Aisha, David, hundreds of others whose names he had learned over months of building this strange family of survivors. "But they chose us," Cal continued. "Out of all the species they've observed, all the civilizations they've documented, They chose humanity to stand against this thing. Not because we're the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced. Because we're the most stubborn. Because we don't know when to quit. Because we've been practicing for this moment since our ancestors picked up burning sticks and charged at predators that should have killed them. He felt something shift in the room. Not hope. Hope was too simple a word. Something older and more fundamental. The same thing that had driven humans to survive ice ages and plagues and wars and every catastrophe the universe had thrown at them. I've spent my whole life carrying weight I thought would crush me, Cal said. The things I saw in combat. The people I couldn't save. The way my own country threw me away when I stopped being useful. I thought that weight was a curse. I thought it was punishment for sins I couldn't name. He met Maria's eyes across the crowded room. But the aliens showed me something different. They showed me that the weight is the point. Every broken thing we carry, every wound that never fully heals, every moment we wanted to give up but didn't, that's what makes us human. That's what makes us impossible. Other species avoid suffering because suffering is inefficient. We transform it. We turn our pain into fuel. We take the worst things that happen to us and use them to become something stronger. Cal's voice grew steady, certain in a way it hadn't been in decades. The silence wants us to lose hope. It wants us to believe that resistance is meaningless, that our suffering has no purpose, that the void will swallow everything eventually, so we might as well surrender now. But we've been staring into that void our entire existence. We've been fighting against meaninglessness since the first human looked up at the stars and decided that their brief, fragile life mattered anyway. He spread his hands, encompassing the room, the city, the world, the species that had confused and terrified observers across 11 galaxies. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to show this thing what 6,000 years of stubborn, irrational, beautiful human defiance looks like. We're going to refuse to despair. We're going to keep building and creating and loving and fighting, not because victory is guaranteed but because that's what humans do. And if the silence has never encountered anything like us, if we really are the first species too stupid to know we should be afraid, then maybe, just maybe, we'll be the ones who finally teach the void what it feels like to lose. The weeks that followed were unlike anything in human history. The silence hung in the sky, visible now as a darkness that blotted out stars. Its presence pressed against human consciousness like a weight, whispering doubts, amplifying despair, trying to erode the will to continue that had sustained the species through every previous crisis. And humanity responded the way it always had. Not with unity. Humans were too fractured, too contentious, too gloriously chaotic for that. They argued and fought and disagreed about everything just as they always had. Governments blamed each other. Religions proclaimed different interpretations. Scientists debated theories while politicians maneuvered for advantage. But underneath the noise, something else was happening. The network Cal had built continued to grow. Survivors found each other, connected through shared experience, spreading the simple message that had emerged from an alien observation craft and a washed-up soldier's journey. Keep going. Whatever the void whispers, keep going. Your suffering has prepared you for this moment. Your scars are your strength. The darkness cannot defeat a species that has been practicing hope since the beginning of time. People who had never met Cal, who would never know his name, began to embody the same defiance. A teacher in Mumbai who had considered quitting returned to her classroom with renewed determination. A doctor in Sao Paulo who had lost faith in medicine found himself staying late to comfort dying patients. A teenager in Lagos who had been planning suicide put down the pills and picked up a paintbrush instead. Small acts. Insignificant in isolation. But they accumulated, spreading across the planet like light spreading across water, each tiny flame illuminating the darkness around it. The alien coalition watched with something approaching awe. The craft began its descent toward Earth. Through the viewport, Cal watched his planet grow larger, details emerging from the blue and green and brown, mountain ranges and coastlines and the scattered lights of cities that never slept. Somewhere down there his cabin waited. His silence. His solitude. But somewhere down there were also others like him. Veterans abandoned by the systems they served. Workers discarded when they stopped being useful. Children growing up in circumstances that should have broken them, somehow refusing to break. The forgotten. The abandoned. The ones who kept going anyway. Cal Rios had spent 20 years learning how to survive alone. Now he realized he would have to learn something much harder. He would have to learn how to help others survive together. The RANG of the craft set Cal down in the same meadow where it had found him. Nothing had changed. His cabin still sat against the treeline, smoke curling from the chimney where embers from yesterday's fire continued to smolder. His truck still waited in the gravel drive, rust spreading along the wheel wells like a slow disease. The mountains still ringed the valley, indifferent to the impossible thing that had just occurred in their shadow. But everything had changed. Cal stood in the meadow as the alien craft rose silently behind him, its hull catching the first light of dawn in colors that human eyes were never meant to see. He did not turn to watch it go. He kept his gaze fixed on his cabin, on the life he had built from the wreckage of himself, on the peace he was about to abandon. Talvesh's final words echoed in his mind, "You will know them when you find them. The ones who carry the weight without being crushed by it. The ones who should have broken but didn't. They are scattered across your world, Cal Rios. In your cities and your villages, your hospitals and your prisons, your battlefields and your homeless shelters. Find them. Remind them what they are. And when the darkness comes, they will be the ones who teach the rest of your species how to stand." Cal walked toward his cabin. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the knowledge in his head had physical weight. He climbed the porch steps, pushed open the door, and stood in the silence of the home he had built with his own hands. The coffee cup from 2 nights ago still sat on the kitchen counter. The Western novel still lay open on the table beside his reading chair. Everything was exactly as he had left it, preserved in amber, waiting for a man who no longer existed to return and resume his quiet life. Cal picked up the coffee cup and washed it in the sink. He closed the book and returned it to the shelf. He moved through the cabin performing small tasks, saying goodbye to each corner of the space that had saved his life. Then he packed a bag, climbed into his truck, and drove away from the only peace he had ever known. The first one he found was named Maria Santos. She worked the night shift at a truck stop outside of Billings, pouring coffee for drivers who never looked at her face and making change for transactions that meant nothing to anyone. She was 53 years old, with gray streaking through her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of decades spent smiling through pain. Cal learned her story in pieces, over 3 nights of sitting at her counter and drinking coffee he didn't need. She had been a nurse once. Emergency room, level 1 trauma center, 16 years of holding people's hands while they died. She had seen things that would have broken most people. Children who didn't survive car accidents, gunshot victims who bled out before surgery could save them, families destroyed in the time it took to speak a single sentence. She had kept going. Through the nightmares and the drinking and the divorce and the years of therapy that never quite worked. She had kept going until one day she couldn't anymore, until she walked out of the hospital and never went back, until she ended up here, pouring coffee at 3 in the morning for strangers who would forget her face before they reached the next state. "Why this place?" Cal asked on the 3rd night. Maria shrugged, refilling his cup without being asked. "It's honest work. Nobody pretends to be something they're not at a truck stop in the middle of the night. Everybody's just trying to get somewhere else." "Do you miss it? The hospital?" She was quiet for a long moment. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across her weathered face. "I miss Matring," she said finally. "I miss being the person who could make a difference when everything was falling apart. But I couldn't do it anymore, you know? I gave everything I had, and when there was nothing left to give, nobody noticed. Nobody cared. I was just another burned-out nurse who couldn't handle the pressure." She smiled, but there was no joy in it. "So now I pour coffee. And I try not to think about all the people I couldn't save." Cal reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device Talvesh had given him. A communicator that looked like an ordinary smartphone but connected to networks humanity hadn't built yet. He set it on the counter between them. "What if I told you that you still matter?" he said. "What if I told you that everything you went through, every patient you lost, every night you wanted to give up but didn't, what if all of that was preparation for something bigger?" Maria looked at the device, then at Cal's face. Something flickered in her eyes, not hope, not yet, but the memory of what hope used to feel like. "I'd say you're crazy," she said. "But I've been pouring your coffee for 3 nights and you don't seem crazy. You seem like someone who's seen something they can't explain." Cal nodded slowly. "I need to show you something," he said. "And after I do you can go back to your life if you want. But I don't think you will." He found them one by one, across months that blurred into a single endless journey. There was Thomas Chin, a former firefighter living in a group home in Seattle, his lungs scarred from smoke inhalation and his mind scarred from the people he couldn't reach in time. There was Aisha Washington, an army medic who had done 3 tours in Afghanistan and come home to find that the country she served had no place for her. There was David Okonkwo, a refugee from South Sudan who had walked 800 miles to escape a war, lost his entire family along the way, and somehow built a new life in a country where he didn't speak the language. Cal found teachers who had burned out trying to save children the system had abandoned. He found social workers who had spent decades fighting battles they could never win. He found doctors and nurses and paramedics, soldiers and cops and firefighters, Ordinary people who had looked into the darkest parts of human existence and refused to look away. They were broken, all of them. Scarred in ways that didn't show on the surface. Carrying weights that would have crushed anyone who hadn't spent years learning how to bear the unbearable. And they were exactly what Talvesh had described. Cal showed them the communicator. He told them what he had seen aboard the alien craft. The visions of human history, the observers who had watched for millennia, the unnamed threat that was coming. He expected disbelief, resistance, the rational skepticism of people who had learned not to trust promises that seemed too good to be true. Instead, he found recognition. "I always knew there was something," Maria said, after Cal showed her the first transmission from Talvesh. "Something bigger than the daily grind, bigger than just surviving until you die. I thought I was fooling myself, but it was real. It was always real." Thomas nodded, his scarred hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. "When you're in the middle of a fire, when everything is chaos and you can't see and you can't breathe, sometimes you feel this presence. Like the universe is watching. Like what you do matters beyond just that moment." He looked at Cal with eyes that had seen too much. "I thought I was imagining it. I thought the smoke had gotten to my brain." "You weren't imagining it," Cal said. "They've been watching us for 6,000 years. And they're terrified of what we might become." The group grew slowly at first, then faster. Cal established a network. Informal, decentralized, held together by nothing but shared experience and a common understanding of what it meant to carry weight without being crushed. They met in coffee shops and church basements, in VA hospitals and homeless shelters, in all the forgotten places where broken people gathered to help each other survive. He watched survivors emerge from rubble. He watched them dig through ruins, pulling out the wounded and the dead with equal care. He watched them share food they did not have, give shelter they could not spare, tend to strangers who had been enemies days before. "But you didn't retreat," Talvesh said. "You rebuilt. Every time. After every war, every plague, every disaster, you chose to try again. You established international organizations designed to prevent future conflicts. You developed laws of war that protected civilians and prisoners. You created systems to heal the psychological wounds your violence inflicted." A note of something like awe entered his voice. "You looked at the worst things your species had ever done, and instead of accepting them as inevitable, you decided to become better." Cal watched a soldier in a bombed-out city hand a piece of bread to a child who should have been his enemy. The gesture was small, private, witnessed by no one except whatever alien observation device had recorded it. "We have files of such moments," Talvesh said. "Millions of them. Individual humans choosing compassion when hatred would have been easier. Choosing mercy when vengeance was justified. Choosing to see the humanity in beings their entire culture told them were monsters." The scene froze. Cal stood surrounded by the ruins of a city he did not recognize, watching that single soldier extend bread to that single child. "This is what we cannot explain," Talvesh continued. "Not your violence, violence we understand. Not your wars, wars are common among developing species. What we cannot explain is why, after everything, you still choose kindness. Why your capacity for destruction has not extinguished your capacity for love." The visions continued for what felt like hours. Cal watched humanity crawl out of the darkness of the medieval period, clawing towards something that resembled progress. He watched the scientific revolution unfold, humans developing methods to understand reality that bypassed their own biases and limitations. He watched the abolition of slavery in some societies, the slow expansion of rights to groups that had been excluded for millennia, the gradual, painful construction of systems designed to protect the weak from the strong. "You must understand how unusual this is," the floating spheres said, their voice like chimes in a gentle wind. "Most species that develop hierarchies maintain them indefinitely. The strong rule the weak because strength confers advantage, and those with advantage do not surrender it voluntarily. Yet your species has produced individuals, many individuals, who fought to dismantle systems that benefited them personally. Who sacrificed comfort and safety and sometimes their lives to extend rights to strangers they would never meet." Cal watched a woman stand before a hostile crowd, demanding the right to vote. He watched a man sit at a lunch counter surrounded by faces twisted with hatred, refusing to move. He watched thousands march across a bridge, knowing they would be beaten, knowing the world was watching, knowing their pain might purchase progress for future generations. "We do not have a word for this," Talvesh said. "This willingness to suffer for an abstraction. To endure harm for principles that offer no personal benefit. In our language, the closest translation would be something like, beautiful madness." Cal felt something tighten in his chest. He had never thought about human history this way. From the inside, it had always seemed like chaos, a random sequence of triumphs and tragedies with no unifying thread. But from out here, from this impossible distance, patterns emerged that he had never seen before. Your species is not defined by your achievements, Talvesh continued. Other species have developed more advanced technology. Others have built larger structures, conquered more territory, accumulated more resources. You are defined by your refusals. Your refusal to accept that might makes right. Your refusal to believe that suffering is meaningless. Your refusal, despite everything, to give up on each other. The final vision was the present. Kel found himself hovering above Earth, watching billions of lives unfold simultaneously. He saw cities pulsing with activity and villages sleeping in darkness. He saw hospitals where strangers worked through the night to save lives that meant nothing to them personally. He saw wars still burning and refugees still fleeing and injustices still being committed by humans who had learned nothing from their history. But he also saw something else. He saw a woman in a flooded village carrying an elderly neighbor to higher ground. He saw a teacher staying late to help a struggling student, receiving no extra pay and expecting no recognition. He saw a man on a subway offering his seat to a pregnant stranger. He saw a million tiny kindnesses happening simultaneously across the planet, none of them recorded, none of them celebrated, none of them motivated by anything except the strange human compulsion to ease each other's burdens. This is what the galaxy sees when we look at Earth, Talvesh said. Not your wars or your pollution or your endless capacity for self-destruction. We see that, certainly. But behind it, woven through every horror, we see this. We see humans choosing, again and again, to be better than they have any logical reason to be. Cal felt tears on his face. He had not cried in 20 years. The coalition has debated for centuries about what to do with your species, Talvesh continued. Some believe we should intervene, guide you toward stability, prevent you from developing weapons that could threaten the broader galaxy. Others believe we should isolate you, quarantine your system until you either mature or destroy yourselves. But there is a third faction. A growing faction. The vision faded. Kel found himself back in the memory vault, his palms still pressed against the frozen smoke, surrounded by alien observers who watched him with expressions he could now almost read. There are those among us who believe humanity should be protected, Talvesh said. Not controlled. Not contained. Protected. Because what you are, this impossible combination of violence and compassion, of destruction and creation, of despair and hope, might be exactly what the universe needs. Cal removed his hand from the pedestal. His body felt strange, as if the visions had rearranged something fundamental inside him. What does the universe need us for? He asked. Talvesh exchanged glances with the other observers. Something passed between them, a communication in frequencies Cal could not perceive. There is something coming, Talvesh said finally. Something that has destroyed civilizations far older and more powerful than ours. We have tried to fight it with technology. We have tried to outthink it with strategy. We have tried to outlast it through patience. Nothing has worked. The obsidian being stepped forward, her blank face somehow conveying deadly seriousness. We have analyzed this threat using every tool at our disposal. We have run simulations across every possible scenario. And we have reached a conclusion that disturbs us deeply. She paused, and in that silence, Kel felt the weight of galaxies pressing down on his shoulders. The only species that might survive what is coming, she said, is one too stubborn to know it should die. Cal stood at the viewport of the alien craft, watching Earth rotate slowly in the darkness below. The other observers had withdrawn, giving him space to process what he had seen and heard. Only Talvesh remained, standing quietly at his side. You still haven't told me what this threat is, Cal said. No, Talvesh agreed. We haven't. Why not? The alien was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weariness that transcended species. Because knowing might change you. Might make you more cautious, more strategic, more like us. He turned those swirling eyes toward Cal, and we cannot afford for humanity to become more like us. The galaxy has enough careful civilizations, enough species that calculate every risk and avoid every danger. What we need, what we desperately, terrifyingly need, is a species reckless enough to charge into the darkness screaming. Cal almost laughed again. The absurdity of it pressed against his chest. Alien civilizations spanning galaxies, watching humanity for millennia, and their conclusion was that the universe needed idiots brave enough to pick fights they couldn't win. My people won't understand this, Cal said. Our leaders, our governments, they'll want technology, alliances, strategic advantages. They'll turn this into politics. Yes, Talvesh said. That is why we did not contact them. He moved to a console that rose from the floor like a growing thing, pressing controls Cal couldn't follow. The coalition has authorized me to make you an offer, Cal Rios. We can return you to your cabin. You can live out your remaining years in peace, knowing what you know but unable to share it. The burden of that knowledge would be significant, but you have carried heavier burdens. Or, Talvesh turned to face him fully. Or you can help us prepare your species for what is coming. Not by fighting battles or making speeches or becoming important in ways humans typically measure importance, but by doing what you have always done best. What's that? Surviving, Talvesh said simply. Showing others how to survive. Finding the humans like yourself, the forgotten, the abandoned, the broken ones who somehow kept going, and helping them understand what they carry inside them. Cal thought about his cabin. His books, his coffee, his careful isolation. He thought about the peace he had constructed from the wreckage of his life, the silence he had wrapped around his wounds like bandages. Then he thought about what he had seen in the memory vault. Millions of humans across thousands of years, choosing kindness over hatred, choosing hope over despair, choosing to keep going when stopping would have been so much easier. He thought about that soldier handing bread to a child in the ruins. What would I have to do? Talvesh gestured toward the viewport, toward the blue marble hanging in the darkness. Go home. Find others like yourself. Help them remember what humanity is capable of. And when the time comes, when the threat we cannot name finally arrives at your doorstep. Be too stupid to run, Cal finished. For the first time, something that looked almost like affection crossed the alien's strange face. You understand better than any of us could have hoped. The observers. The chamber they led Cal into defied geometry. Walls stretched upward into darkness that should not have existed inside a craft this size. The floor beneath his boots felt solid but looked like liquid mercury, rippling with each step yet supporting his weight without hesitation. In the center of the room stood a pedestal that resembled frozen smoke. Translucent, shifting, somehow both there and not there at the same time. The memory vault, Talvesh explained. Every observation our coalition has made across 11 galaxies is stored here. Every species we have watched rise and fall. Every civilization that burned bright and then extinguished itself. He gestured toward the pedestal. And every moment of human history we deemed significant enough to preserve. Cal approached the pedestal slowly. The other aliens had gathered around the chamber's edges, their strange forms barely visible in the ambient glow. He could feel their attention like heat on his skin. How does it work? You touch it, Talvesh said. And you see what we saw. Cal hesitated. His instincts screamed warnings. Unknown technology, alien intentions, the thousand ways this could go wrong. But those same instincts had kept him alive through 3 deployments and a decade of isolation. They had earned a rest. He placed his palm against the frozen smoke. The universe exploded. Cal stood on a plain that stretched to every horizon, grass rippling under a wind he could not feel. The sky above was wrong, too many stars arranged in patterns he did not recognize. And there, huddled around a small fire in the endless darkness, sat a group of figures that made his breath catch. They were human. Unmistakably, impossibly human. But they were not like any humans Cal had ever seen. Their bodies were smaller, their foreheads more pronounced, their eyes holding a wariness that spoke of predators lurking in every shadow. They wore animal skins and carried sharpened sticks, and they gathered around their fire with the desperate intensity of creatures who knew that light meant survival. 200,000 years ago, Talvesh's voice echoed in Cal's mind. Your species had just emerged. You were prey animals, Cal. Weak, slow, lacking natural weapons. Every predator on your continent could kill you. Every environmental shift threatened extinction. By our calculations, you had a 4% chance of surviving another 10,000 years. Cal watched as one of the early humans, a female with tangled dark hair and fierce eyes, picked up a burning branch from the fire. She held it toward the darkness beyond their circle, thrusting it at shadows that might have contained threats or might have contained nothing at all. The others watched her. And then one by one they picked up branches of their own. This was the moment we began paying attention, Talvesh continued. Not because you discovered fire. Many species discover fire. But because of what happened next. The scene shifted. Cal watched the same group, or their descendants, facing a massive creature that resembled a bear but stood twice as tall. The humans should have run. Every survival instinct should have sent them scattering into the night. Instead they attacked. They attacked with rocks and sticks and burning branches. They attacked screaming, a sound that seemed to confuse the predator more than injure it. They attacked not as individuals but as a unit, Each human somehow knowing where the others would be, coordinating without language, moving as a single organism with 20 limbs and one purpose. The predator retreated. "You should have died that night," Talvesh said. "Every model we had said you would die. Instead, you invented coordinated hunting. You invented psychological warfare. You invented the concept of refusing to accept your place in the food chain." Pause. We had never seen anything like it. The visions came faster now. Cal watched humanity spread across continents, adapting to deserts and frozen tundras and tropical jungles that should have killed them. He watched them develop language, that strange miracle of shared meaning that let one human pour the contents of their mind into another. He watched them paint on cave walls, not for any practical purpose but simply because something inside them needed to create beauty. Art, Talvesh said. We did not understand it at first. Resources spent on activities with no survival value. Time wasted on images that could not be eaten or worn or used as weapons. It seemed like a flaw, an inefficiency that would eventually be corrected by natural selection. Cal watched a young woman in animal skins mixing pigments by firelight, her face illuminated with concentration as she painted a running horse on stone. Around her, others slept or kept watch or tended to children. But she painted. She painted as if the act itself was as essential as breathing. It took us 3,000 years to understand what we were seeing, Talvesh continued. Art was not inefficiency. Art was communication with the future. Every painting, every carved figure, every decorated tool, they were messages from humans who knew they would die, sent to humans who had not yet been born. You were the first species we encountered that cared about generations you would never meet. The vision shifted again. Cal found himself standing in an ancient city, Babylon, perhaps, or somewhere even older. Massive walls rose around him, and thousands of humans moved through streets that buzzed with commerce and conversation and the endless energy of civilization. And then there was this, Talvesh said. Cities. Millions of individuals choosing to live together in spaces that should have bred conflict and disease. Strangers trusting strangers. Systems of law and trade that required believing other humans would honor agreements they could easily break. Cal watched a merchant hand goods to a customer, receiving small metal discs in return. The transaction was so mundane, so ordinary, that its impossibility almost escaped him. Do you understand what we saw in that moment? Talvesh asked. That merchant had never met that customer before. They would likely never meet again. There was no family bond, no tribal obligation, nothing that should have compelled honesty. Yet both parties trusted the transaction would be fair. Both parties believed in the concept of money, an abstraction, a shared fiction with no physical reality. They cooperated because they chose to believe cooperation was possible. The obsidian being's voice joined Talvesh's, colder and more clinical. We have observed 947 species that developed cities. 812 of those species collapsed within 1,000 years, destroyed by the conflicts that inevitably arise when strangers share resources. The others survived only by developing rigid caste systems that eliminated individual choice entirely. Pause. Your species did neither. You built cities that constantly teetered on the edge of chaos, held together by nothing but shared belief in institutions that existed only because you collectively decided they should exist. It was impossible. It was magnificent. It terrified us. The visions grew darker. Cal watched wars unfold across millennia, bronze swords giving way to iron, iron giving way to steel, steel giving way to gunpowder and then to bombs that could level cities in a single flash. He watched humans slaughter each other over land, over resources, over ideas, over differences so small that alien observers could not identify them. This is where most civilizations destroy themselves, Talvesh said quietly. The development of weapons capable of mass destruction. The moment when a species realizes it has the power to end its own existence. Cal found himself standing in a field. Two armies faced each other across churned mud, their weapons primitive by modern standards but devastating enough. He watched young men charge into walls of arrows and spears, their bodies falling in waves, their screams mixing into a single sound of agony that seemed to shake the earth itself. We calculated the casualties of your species' wars, the obsidian being said. Across your recorded history, approximately 1 billion humans have died in armed conflict. 1 billion individuals, each with thoughts and dreams and people who loved them, erased by violence your species chose to inflict upon itself. The vision shifted. A city burned around Cal, Dresden or Tokyo or one of 100 others. Bodies lay in the streets, some burned beyond recognition, others seemingly untouched but lifeless nonetheless. The smell of smoke and death filled his nostrils even though he knew none of this was real. By every standard we use to measure civilizational health, This should have ended you, Talvesh continued. This level of self-inflicted trauma destroys species. The psychological damage alone should have prevented recovery. You should have retreated into small, isolated communities, too traumatized to ever trust large-scale cooperation again. And then Cal watched something else. The Eldar who emerged from the craft was smaller than Cal expected. He stood perhaps 5 feet tall, with skin the color of burnished copper and eyes that held no pupils, only swirling patterns of gold and amber that seemed to shift with his emotions. He wore a simple gray robe that covered him from neck to ankle, and he carried no visible weapons. He walked toward Cal's cabin with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never been attacked by a stranger. Cal understood immediately that this being had never known war the way humans knew it. Whatever conflicts his species faced, they were not the kind that taught you to scan every room for exits, to calculate the distance to cover, to see every stranger as a potential threat until proven otherwise. Cal remained on his porch. He did not reach for the rifle leaning against the wall behind him. "You are Cal Rios," the being said. His voice was musical, each word carrying undertones that resonated somewhere in Cal's hindbrain. "You served your nation for 23 years. You received 17 commendations for valor. You were wounded 4 times in service of causes you did not choose. And then you were forgotten." Cal said nothing. His silence had become a weapon over the years, a way of forcing others to fill the empty space with their own uncertainties. The being seemed untroubled by the lack of response. He climbed the porch steps slowly, deliberately, giving Cal every opportunity to object or retreat. When Cal did neither, the being settled into the empty chair beside him as if they were old friends resuming a conversation interrupted by decades. "My name is Talvesh," he said. "I have watched your species for 112 of your years. I have seen empires rise and fall. I have witnessed atrocities that would break the minds of my own people. And I have seen small acts of kindness that restored my faith in the possibility of goodness." He turned those strange, swirling eyes toward Cal. "You are the reason I asked to make contact." "Me specifically?" Cal's voice was rusty from disuse. He could not remember the last time he had spoken more than a few words in a single day. "You specifically," Talvesh confirmed. "Not your presidents or your generals or your scientists. A man who was used and discarded by the very institutions he served. A man who had every reason to let bitterness consume him, yet chose isolation over destruction." The alien leaned forward slightly. "Do you understand how remarkable that choice was?" Cal thought about it. He thought about the years after his discharge, when the nightmares were worst, when the rage inside him felt like a living thing clawing at his ribs. He thought about the guns he owned and the lists he could have made and the buildings he could have walked into with nothing left to lose. He thought about the morning he drove to this valley instead, the morning he chose to build something rather than destroy something, the morning he decided that his suffering did not give him the right to create more suffering. "I just wanted to be left alone," Cal said. "Yes." Talvesh's voice was soft. "That is precisely the point. Your species produces individuals who experience profound trauma and respond not with violence, not with vengeance, but with withdrawal. You choose to carry your pain in isolation rather than spread it to others. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How many civilizations have collapsed because their broken individuals could not resist the urge to break others in turn?" Cal looked at the alien craft sitting in his meadow, its impossible curves glowing softly in the gathering darkness. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because my people have made a decision," Talvesh said. "For 6,000 years, we have watched humanity from a distance, waiting for you to destroy yourselves. We were wrong. You are not approaching destruction. You are approaching something else entirely. Something we do not understand." He paused. "Something that frightens us." Cal almost laughed. The sound caught in his throat, unfamiliar and strange. "You're afraid of us?" "We are afraid of what you might become." Talvesh rose from the chair, his robes settling around him like water. "Your species is fractured, traumatized, constantly at war with itself. By every metric we use to measure civilizational stability, you should have collapsed centuries ago. Instead, you grow stronger with each crisis. You adapt. You evolve. You turn your wounds into weapons and your failures into fuel." He walked to the edge of the porch, staring up at the stars that were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. "We have studied thousands of species across 11 galaxies. None of them did what you do. None of them could do what you do. And what exactly do we do?" Talvesh turned back to face him. "You suffer," he said simply. "And then you rise." The interior of the alien craft was nothing like Cal expected. He had imagined sterile corridors, blinking consoles, the cold efficiency of technology so advanced it felt more like magic than engineering. Instead, Talvesh led him into a space that felt almost organic, walls that curved like the inside of a seashell, surfaces that responded to touch with subtle shifts in color and texture, ambient light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. There were others aboard. Cal counted 7 beings of different species, each one watching him with expressions he could not read. A tall, willowy creature with skin like polished obsidian. A being that resembled a floating cluster of luminescent spheres. Something that might have been a plant, or might have been a very patient rock, or might have been something else entirely. The Galactic Observation Coalition, Talvesh explained. Representatives from the 7 eldest civilizations in the local cluster. We have been monitoring Earth for varying lengths of time. Some of us since before your species learned to write. Cal felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. He had stood before generals and senators, before crowds of protesters and panels of military judges. None of those experiences had prepared him for this. What do you want from me? We want to understand, said the obsidian being. Her voice was like wind through broken glass. Your species defies every model we have constructed. You are violent, irrational, self-destructive. You poison your own world and slaughter your own kind over disagreements that seem trivial from any objective perspective. Yet you persist. You grow. You reach toward the stars even as you tear each other apart. She took a step closer, her blank face somehow conveying intense curiosity. How? Cal thought about the question. He thought about the men he had served with, the ones who came home broken and the ones who did not come home at all. He thought about his grandfather, who survived the Depression and the Second World War and 3 heart attacks, who kept working his farm until the day he died because he did not know any other way to live. He thought about his mother, who raised 4 children alone after his father left, who worked 2 jobs and never complained, who told Cal every night that tomorrow would be better even when she had no reason to believe it. We don't have a choice, Cal said finally. Giving up isn't in our nature. We've tried, believe me. Individually, collectively, we've tried to surrender to despair more times than I can count. It never sticks. There's always someone who refuses to quit. Someone who looks at the ruins and starts rebuilding. Someone who buries the dead and then plants a garden. He shrugged. Maybe we're too stupid to know when we're beaten. Maybe we're too stubborn to accept the obvious. But whatever it is, we can't turn it off. We just keep going. The aliens exchanged glances, or what Cal interpreted as glances, given that several of them did not appear to have eyes. Your leaders believe they represent humanity, Talvesh said. Your presidents, your generals, your billionaires. They speak in your name. They make decisions that affect billions. But they do not understand what you understand. They have not experienced what you have experienced. He gestured toward the others in the room. That is why we sought you out. Not someone important. Someone real. Someone who carries the weight of humanity's story in their bones. Cal felt something shift inside him. Something he had buried a long time ago. What happens now? Talvesh smiled, or performed an expression that Cal's brain translated as a smile. Now you see what your species has accomplished. Not through the eyes of your historians or your politicians, but through ours. We will show you what humanity looks like from the outside. And then you will help us understand the one thing our observations could never explain. Which is? The alien's swirling eyes seemed to darken. Why you keep fighting. Why you never stop. Why, no matter how many times the universe breaks you, you always find a way to stand back up. Cal looked around the impossible craft, at the beings who had traveled distances he could not comprehend to ask questions he did not know how to answer. Then he did something he had not done in years. He laughed. You came all this way, he said, to ask a washed-up soldier why humans don't know when to quit? We came all this way, Talvesh replied, to ask the only species that ever confused us why the rest of the galaxy should be afraid. The craft hummed beneath Cal's feet. Through a viewport he had not noticed before, he watched Earth shrink. A blue marble suspended in infinite darkness, impossibly fragile, impossibly resilient. Somewhere down there, billions of people were living their lives. Fighting their battles. Carrying their wounds. Refusing, despite everything, to surrender. Cal Rios watched his world disappear into the distance. And for the first time in 20 years he felt something like hope. The forgotten. The Eldar had watched Earth for 6,000 years. Their observation stations hung in the cold silence between Jupiter and Mars, cloaked behind electromagnetic barriers that bent light around their hulls like water parting around stone. Generations of Eldar scientists lived and died aboard those stations, dedicating their entire existence to a single question that had consumed their civilization since the first primitive humans learned to shape fire. What makes them survive? It was not supposed to happen this way. The mathematical models were clear. Species that developed on worlds like Earth, worlds torn by tectonic instability, bombarded by cosmic radiation, plagued by predators and parasites and 1,000 evolutionary dead ends, those species never reached the stars. They burned bright for a few millennia, built monuments to their own greatness, then collapsed under the weight of their own contradictions. The Eldar had documented this pattern across 11 galaxies. They had watched the Vorath Empire consume itself in civil war. They had recorded the slow extinction of the crystalline mines of Andromeda, a species so advanced they forgot how to reproduce. They had mourned the singing forests of Kepler 442b, sentient ecosystems that achieved perfect harmony only to be sterilized by a gamma-ray burst they lacked the technology to predict. Humanity should have followed the same path. The Black Death alone should have ended them. The Eldar calculated a 73% probability that the plague would trigger societal collapse, fragmenting human civilization into isolated tribes that would never recover their technological momentum. Instead, the survivors rebuilt. They developed new systems of medicine, new philosophies of governance, new ways of understanding their place in an indifferent universe. Then came the wars. Endless, brutal conflicts fought over patches of territory, ideological differences, resources that could have been shared with minimal effort. The Eldar watched humans invent weapons capable of ending their own species, then spend decades constructing elaborate systems designed to prevent those weapons from ever being used. It was madness. It was genius. It was something the Eldar had never encountered in all their centuries of observation. By the time humans split the atom, the Eldar High Council convened an emergency session for the first time in 400 years. They will destroy themselves within a generation, declared Consul Vareth, the eldest member of the Observation Corps. The pattern is unmistakable. Every species that discovers nuclear fission before achieving psychological unity follows the same trajectory. We should withdraw our stations and document the extinction from a safe distance. But one voice dissented. Her name was Cyrell, and she had spent her entire adult life studying a single human settlement in what the locals called Montana. She had watched 3 generations of the same family work the same land, surviving droughts and blizzards and economic collapses that would have broken any rational species. She had observed them bury their dead, mourn for precisely the amount of time their culture deemed appropriate, then return to their fields the next morning as if grief was simply another season to endure. You are making the same mistake our ancestors made with the Vorath, Cyrell told the council. You are measuring their technology when you should be measuring their spirit. Humans do not survive despite their suffering. They survive because of it. Every catastrophe makes them stronger. Every failure teaches them something new. They are not approaching extinction. They are approaching transcendence. The council dismissed her concerns as romantic attachment, a known hazard among long-term observers who spent too many years watching a single species. But they did not withdraw the stations. And when decades passed without nuclear annihilation, when humans began reaching toward their own moon with rockets built from the same technology that could have ended their civilization, the council quietly upgraded Cyrell's security clearance and asked her to prepare a comprehensive report. That report took 40 years to complete. Its conclusion was a single sentence that would reshape Eldar foreign policy for the next century. Humanity is not a species. Humanity is a process. Cal Rios had not thought about the stars in a long time. He lived in a cabin 12 miles from the nearest paved road, in a valley so remote that satellite maps still showed it as unincorporated wilderness. The nearest town was a collection of gas stations and feed stores called Miller's Crossing, population 300 and falling. Cal drove there once a month to buy supplies, exchanging as few words as possible with the clerk at the general store, then returned to his valley and his silence and his carefully constructed isolation. He was 47 years old. His hair had gone gray at the temples. His hands, once steady enough to thread a needle in complete darkness, now trembled slightly when he poured his morning coffee. The army had trained those hands to do things he no longer allowed himself to remember. The army had also promised to take care of him when the training was done. The army lied. Cal's discharge papers listed his condition as service-related adjustment disorder, a clinical phrase that meant nothing and covered everything. It meant he could not sleep without dreaming of Kandahar. It meant crowds made his chest tight and his vision narrow. It meant the government had squeezed every useful year out of his body and mind, then discarded him with a handshake and a pamphlet about veteran services that no longer existed by the time he tried to access them. He did not blame them. Blame required energy he no longer possessed. Instead, he built his cabin with his own hands, using skills he learned from YouTube videos and library books checked out from a branch 40 miles away. He installed solar panels on the roof and dug a well in the backyard and taught himself to hunt and fish and preserve food for the long Montana winters. He created a life that required nothing from the world that had abandoned him. It was not happiness. Cal had forgotten what happiness felt like. But it was peace, or something close enough to peace that he could survive inside it. The night the elder came, Cal was sitting on his porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple. He had a cup of coffee in his hands, his third of the day, a habit he knew was unhealthy but could not bring himself to break, and a paperback novel open on his knee. The book was a western, something about cowboys and cattle drives and a simpler time that probably never existed. Cal read it without really absorbing the words. Reading was not about entertainment. Reading was about filling the silence. The light appeared at 8:47 p.m. At first, Cal thought it was a helicopter. The military conducted training exercises in the mountains sometimes, young soldiers learning to navigate terrain that Cal knew better than his own reflection. He watched the light descend toward the valley floor, waiting for the familiar thump of rotor blades, the wash of displaced air that would scatter the dead leaves around his porch. The sound never came. The light touched down in the meadow 300 yards from his cabin, and Cal realized it was not a helicopter at all. It was something else.